Hello, my name is Maxwell Boltinghouse, and I have been asked to speak with you regarding one of my favorite cases, Cohen versus California. I am a former DU law grad. I'm currently a practicing attorney up in Washington State outside of Seattle. I practiced for a bit in Colorado, and during my time there, had the privilege of working on a couple of protest cases that directly involve free speech. The reason that this case is one of my favorite cases is because it was such a landmark case at the time that tested the limits of free speech and was a rather unpopular opinion when it came out. Cohen versus California involves a man by the name of Paul Cohen who wore a jacket that said "fuck the draft" on the back of it into a California municipal courthouse. While in the courthouse, no one was alarmed, no one was offended, presumably nobody reached out, but he was ultimately reported and cited and charged. He was charged with violating a statute that prohibited maliciously and willfully disturbing the peace or quiet of any neighborhood or person. In that case, California argued that the speech in question, "fuck the draft," was offensive and subject to regulation because it was seen as likely to incite violence or disturb the peace. The state believed that it had a compelling interest in preventing such incitement and regulating such speech, as it could pose a threat to public safety and order. They argued that the government had a duty to prevent the harm that could be caused by this speech, and that it was appropriate for the state to regulate it as such because it was either obscene, something that constituted fighting words, or falling within one of the other categories of regulated obscene speech. The state argued that that regulation was ultimately necessary to maintain social harmony and prevent the incitement of violence, and the restriction was ultimately reasonable because it was narrowly tailored to achieve those goals, and the effects that it had upon other speech was minimal, they posed. Despite these arguments, however, the Supreme Court determined in its decision that the speech, even if it was offensive or vulgar, was protected under the First Amendment. The court found that the manner of communication was also important, as the justices noted that Mr. Cohen's message was conveyed through an article of clothing, which was more of a passive form of expression and did not pose a direct threat to the peace and order of the courthouse. No one was alarmed. No one was up in arms about it. It was a statement of words on the back of a jacket. He was not there with a bullhorn. He was not shouting at people. Ultimately, in looking at that issue, the court considered the First Amendment exception for fighting words and found that the term, or the words "fuck the draft," did not fall within that exception. The words, though maybe a vulgar and offensive term, were not directed at any specific purpose with the intent of inciting immediate violent reaction. Instead, the court recognized that Mr. Cohen's specific message was the form of a symbolic speech, and it was aimed at expressing his political viewpoint regarding the draft, or "fuck the draft." The court did consider also, as raised by the government, that someone may forcefully try to remove that clothing or incite violence as a result of it, but the court did determine that that was a speculative determination at best and was inconsistent with the reactions of those around him at the time that it happened. In looking at the case, the court also rejected the state's argument that the message on Cohen's jacket was obscene and therefore not protected by the First Amendment. The government's compelling interest in protecting freedom's expression, even if the speech was considered offensive to some, was noted by the court, and the California government argued that the speech in question was obscene and thus subject to regulation. Despite that, however, the Supreme Court found it not to be so, determining that obscenity refers to speech or material that is offensive or disgusting, typically because it is sexual or violent content, and it is not protected by the First Amendment as such. However, the Supreme Court defined obscenity as speech or material that is utterly without redeeming social value, and found that the speech in question here did have a material social value, and therefore was not obscene. The court recognized that the speech within Mr. Cohen's jacket, his political viewpoint about the draft, had value. The court noted that while the speech may be considered to some as offensive, it is important to protect the freedom of speech because even if it is an unpopular opinion or controversial, it still has a political value in a democracy. The court was ultimately the most concerned with government censorship of political and unpopular expression, and emphasized the importance of protecting that constitutional right within the freedom of expression. In his majority of opinion, Justice Harlan emphasized the importance of protecting even the most unpopular speech. He wrote that the ability of government, sentinel of the public welfare, to shut off discussion of vital social issues such as the draft is something that is a prized American freedom, and that best way to preserve the freedom of expression is to use it. The decision in Cohen versus California was informed by a broader understanding of the purpose of free speech in American society and the role it plays in fostering a more capable citizenry and more perfect polity. The court recognized that free speech, including speech that may be seemingly offensive, was a powerful tool in removing government restraints from political discussion and allowing individuals to voice their opinions. The freedom of expression, while it may often result in a verbal cacophony and discord, was deemed a necessary side effect of the greater values that an open debate permits us to achieve. The court recognized the value of a variety of opinions and recognized the value of the smallest among us, even when that value may be unpopular. The court also recognized in this case the dual communicative function of speech, as words often convey not only ideas, but also emotions that cannot be expressed in any other way. It was emphasized that the Constitution cannot be seen as having little or no regard for the emotive force of speech, as this function is often just as important, if not more so, than the cognitive content of the speech itself. Sometimes the shock of a fuck the draft is the most important aspect of it, and the court recognized that emotion within that. The emphasis on the emotive power of speech was seen as especially relevant in the case Cohen versus California, where the message of Cohen's jacket conveyed not only his political viewpoint, but also that strong emotional response I just mentioned. The court thus concluded that the government could not censor speech simply because it was offensive or unpopular, as the freedom of expression must be protected even if it serves as a means of conveying seemingly trifling or annoying instances of individual expression. You may not agree with it, but that is not the basis to regulate it. The court was deeply concerned about the potential for government censorship and censorship of political and unpopular expression. The court recognized that if the government were allowed to censor particular words, it could easily be used as a pretext for suppressing unpopular viewpoints. The court emphasized that this censorship would carry a substantial risk of suppressing ideas as well, which would have a harmful effect on society as a whole and would decrease the ability of the democratic process to function. The court saw little societal benefit in opening the door to such dangerous results and was therefore wary of any measures that could lead to censorship of political or unpopular expression. The court believed that the protection of free speech, even if it includes speech that is offensive or unpopular, is essential to the functioning democracy and to the preservation of individual dignity and choice and discord. For those reasons, Justice Harlan and the majority in this case issued their ruling, and the decision in Cohen versus California established clearly that the court cannot censor or punish speech simply because it is offensive or unpopular. The case remains a significant landmark in the fight for freedom of speech and demonstrates the crucial role of the First Amendment in protecting the rights of all Americans. It is important to remember this case and its lasting impact on protecting those freedoms. The bold statement of "fuck the draft" serves as a reminder of the power of the expression and the power needed to defend the First Amendment and the value that those political ideas have in American democracy. For all of those reasons, it's been my absolute pleasure to speak with you about this case. Thank you very much for your time.